let's begin. My name is Ekaterina. I'm co-founder of Future London Academy, and today we are joined by incredible Martin, who is the co-founder of Future Laboratory, one of the most well-known futures consultancies in the world, with offices in London and Melbourne. And they assemble these incredible multidisciplinary teams of journalists, researchers, innovations analysts to think about what's now, what's new, what's next. Martin is also an editor-in-chief of LSN Global. He has written several books, including The Tomorrow People and the Trend Forecaster Handbook. And in general, he thinks about the future all the time. So this is why we will be talking today about the future of the future, and everything we should know about what might come our way. Welcome, Martin. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. And as you can see, I've produced a grey background because I thought, we're so unsure about how the future will look. And I was asked recently, somebody said, what's the color of tomorrow? And in my head, it's blue, because I'm always thinking about innovation, about change. But we did some research, and I'd asked a group of people who were under 40 about what color they saw the future. And they said grey, which surprised me, because grey I always associate with, vagueness, doubt, fog, cloudiness, things that suggest we are unsure and uncertain about tomorrow. So really, I always think about, that is the question we all ask ourselves. What does the future look like? What's the color of tomorrow? And I always think, when you start a conversation, if I can ask everybody to imagine that the future is blue, because blue is the color that allows you to look into the horizon, into the future, into opportunity. I kind of feel for a time together, I'd like people to shift into that future space. So they're really thinking with the lens of a futurist, and that horizon line, the infinity line, the deep blue, the notion of looking out, gazing, as opposed to looking in, reflective. So really, I'm hoping that our time together will be spent on that journey pushing out, rather than a journey just of reflection and a journey of closure and looking in, which I think is how a lot of people are feeling about the future at the moment.
I love that you started with such a visual metaphor for the future. And you probably know, if you asked us, we would say the future color is yellow.
Of
Because
course,
Future
yes.
believes in the positive future. We do believe that there are so many things to be excited about. And I know you very much think about different versions of the future and different opportunities that can be possible in the future, no matter whether the things work out the way we think they will or not. There are always opportunities for us to think how we can change things. And I would like to actually to start with a quote that you said once: the future hasn't happened, therefore the best way to determine is to create it. So I love how you talk about that we can't predict the future, but we as creatives, and people here on the call are creatives, can determine what they look like. So what do you think about the future and how we can create it?
Look, it is a difficult thing, because a lot of people, when you say you're a forecaster, they confuse forecasting with prediction. And there is a huge difference. Forecasting is where you're extrapolating forward based on certain insights or certain data sets or certain assumptions you're making. But you're not, I think, traveling forward with a view to predicting. You're traveling forward with a sense of where lines potentially will coalesce at a future point, at a future place, and at a future time. And what you're trying to do is to find the best existing and past data to help you make that third push into the future. So the notion that you ultimately are creating it is the case, because really, if you think about it, even, and we'll probably look at this later, even the best, general AI tools can't really predict or anticipate. What they're doing is simply extrapolating. And that being the case, creatives are in a hugely important position to be able to look at current insights, look at certain suppositions we can make, and then to start building and iterating what these potential solutions could look like. So I always think, you previously in forecasting. It was very linear, very didactic, very singular. So we used to talk about the future. And now we talk about futures, plural, because increasingly we understand that the more people and the more diversity and the more difference and the more intersectionality we involve in that conversation, the greater the chances are that the future we suggest or the futures we suggest be places that might be equitable to all of us. And I think a lot of the time, if you think about the future as you see it in science fiction and the future as you see it in speculative fiction, it can either be dystopian or it can be very much about a privileged view of what tomorrow looks like. That kind of high tech, sentience, robots, automation, 3D printers, and that's great, but it's a very Western view of what tomorrow could look like. And I obviously remind people, depending on your background, depending on your gender, your sexuality, your social positioning, all of these things should be mapped in a way that allows us to build the best kind of futures. And I suspect that a lot of forecasting has spent too much time creating futures which brands would like to inhabit because it suits their kind of purpose of the positioning versus the kind of futures that people would like to inhabit because it suits I guess the crabby, cranky, archaic, disruptive nature that we are as people. And as you know, for a lot of businesses and corporations and brands, that's not how they like the world. They like it tidy and polished, and hopefully, if they get it right, with their logo shaped and placed firmly in the middle. And that's not how we work as futurists. We're trying to get a different, more collegiate, collaborative sense of how this thing can look.
This is brilliant. You said multiple futures, and this is actually reflecting our community that we have at Futureland Academy. When we were collecting questions for this interview, we probably had the most diverse set of questions we've ever had for any interviews that we had, because there are so many questions about the future. There are multiple futures. There are multiple industries as effects and multiple things in people's mind. And as you said, if you are coming from a different culture, background, your view on the future and what you're interested in the future will be very different than someone else. So I love that we opened with this. So there will be many pockets that we'll go into. And for everyone who is listening us live, I would love if you could put in the chat 3 things that you're most interested in the future, just as words, maybe future of science, of community, or finance. I don't know, just let us know 3 top things that on your mind when you think about the future. So again, we can have those different conversations, and also we'll see how different it is based on where you are in the world, what's on your mind right now. So that would be fantastic. And I would love to follow up with what you said, Martin, that the kind of there are multiple futures. Are you seeing any particular industries right now, or areas, or things that are affected or will change more in the future than others, just based on what you're seeing and how the world is changing?
The best way to think about tomorrow is to think about the past. And I always think if you were born in like 1880, and then jump cut to 1910. So we're kind of on the cusp of things like, photography, early telegraphy, early, combustion engines, a hint of flight. We're beginning to see the first kind of, kind of things taking to the air. And then jump cut to 1905 to 1910, we had a theory of relativity. We had cubism. We have cars. We have first TV broadcasts being made. We have radio. And suddenly, that person who was used to seeing horses going past their house were suddenly seeing flying machines go past their house. And I kind of feel that currently, this is where we are sitting in the world we live in. Quantum is beginning to seep into our consciousness. AI is no longer a dream. It's becoming a really hard and fast reality. The metaverse, 5G, synthetic science. So suddenly we're about to go through a second-rate leap that a lot of us are just not prepared for. So if you think about how space travel has come back into consciousness. How we're thinking now about a completely different way of designing the world. Two women created the CRISPR scissors, which allows us to genetically alter entire human profiles at source. So we are just at this, I'm going to call it the great acceleration, the second great acceleration. And that excites me because every industry is implicated, but also the industries we haven't imagined yet will be coming online over the next decade. So if I'm a designer and I'm a creative and I'm somebody who works in the industries of what I call concept and imagination, suddenly it is my time. Previously, design, things like architecture, art, culture, there always seemed to be added value because I always think I never meet the chief design officer in the boardroom. I meet the chief finance, the chief tech, whatever. I don't meet the chief, I do meet chief creatives now because we realize the role of it. So I kind of feel there's an excitement out there that potentially will be misread because a lot of designers I speak to and a lot of creators, as we saw recently in the Hollywood strikes, the big single thing they were complaining about was, of course, AI, how it will damage creativity, how it will usurp it, how it will remove our ability to be human. And I think, oh my gosh, if that's all it takes to do that, then bring on AI. If we're worried about a thing that can do our basic jobs better, then we really do not deserve to be on this planet. Because at some point, the planet will make up its mind. Who is best for my survival? Is it going to be the human or is it going to be AI? I can put a bet on it at the moment. Unless we step up as humans, AI will out-trump us, outbeat us, out-create us. But that doesn't mean we are failing. It means we have to think differently. So that's why I'm excited about what industries could happen or how they're changing. They're going to change hugely. And if we're not with that change, we risk being like the Luddite, destroying the machine. Why? Well, because we are failing to understand that the machine is not the issue. It is people who are the issues, and machines will only make us think better about how we define ourselves as human.
I love this. Was a very intriguing
It's a
start,
rant.
and
It's an Irish rant.
and I love that you already mentioned actually three things that we'll dive deeper in today. One of them is the role of creatives and chief design officers in the boardroom, as well as the role of AI and how it affects us, and also the future of science and how, again, advances in science will affect all of us and as designers, but also as people and our cultures and the world that we live in. I would love to start with the first part about the chief design officers and creatives in the boardroom, because this is something as Futureland Academy very passionate about bringing more creatives to the boardroom and giving them all the leadership skills, all the business skills to actually be confident there and making real progress. So with everything that you're seeing, as you said, how the industry is changing, do you think there is a real potential for creatives to step up, and what potentially they can bring to the boardroom that so far no one else brought at the C-level?
Yes, look. I always think that, and I still meet CEOs who are in that. And I don't normally kind of call out generational things. I think there is a huge separate debate about behavior versus age cohorts. But a lot of CEOs I meet are, and whether they're male or female, they will be in their 60s, 70s, and for them, with rare exception, creativity is still seen to be an adjunct to something else in the boardroom. I sit on a number of kind of non-exec boards for companies who are under 35 in terms of the CEOs or the people running them. And for them, creativity sits at the heart of thinking. So not just in terms of design or in terms of output, but in terms of conceptual thinking. They see that currently we are cusping into an age where it will be possible. So if you think about biohacking, if you think about what's happening with longevity, you think about what's happening with superhumanism, we're not just talking about designing packaging or designing products. We're talking about designing people. And unless you have conversations that look at these things in a way where design is core to the thinking and it's core to the understanding, we're never going to advance in the way that I think we need to advance because currently, I was talking to a number of biohackers who see themselves as genetic engineers, genetic architects, they're creators. Their way of looking at the world and their language is so much based on their understanding of growing up in the metaverse, their understanding of gaming, their understanding of role play, and how these things are all malleable and transformable. And I think that difference is, in one position, creativity is the core and the source and the power, and in the other, it's still seen to be something that we buy in when we've done everything else. And I think what we need to put in the middle is bringing these things together so that we understand one is not subservient or separate from the other. And I do think, from a business perspective, increasingly that's the conversation I'm hearing. But I think what we now need is a clear manifesto as to how we develop and grow these conversations, and also what does that board of the future, or that business of the future, what does it look like? Because I think once we create an idea for how the thing looks, we can start populating the idea with the people we need, or the AI, or the processes to make this thing a reality. So I kind of feel the conversations have started, but we need to make them more directed, and to understand, if we're not seeing creative in the way we should do it, why not? How are we defining it? And what are we doing to put these things into place and position?
And why not? Why are we not seeing more creatives? And what is the future of boardroom? I think this is most exciting question that I'm sure a lot of our listeners would love to hear.
Without going into too many things, because my brain is a little bit like a magpie thing, there's always lots of things in it. But I always realize that, if you think about productivity and growth, and the notion of how we measure these things, it was always measured about, in terms of profit. And profit was seen to be initially about tangible product, and now it's about intangible concepts. So we're entering that realm now, where we're selling ideas rather than just selling products. And I think because of that, we've had a whole group of people who were just about manufacturing in a very kind of binary way, people developing processes in a very binary way, and people developing business propositions in a very binary way. I think now the world of tomorrow requires concept and ideas. It requires a different sense of how we generate, profit, how we create growth, how we define productivity. And I think, because these things are slightly not nebulous concept, but they are more about intellectual understanding and negotiation than they are just about physical, mechanical production. That's more a creative process than it is just an engineered solution. And I think at the moment we need to start teaching creatives the language that they need to negotiate in the boardroom, or they need to be able to kind of discuss, agree on how we start developing these things in a different way. So it's part of it is a structural issue, part of it is understanding concept, and the other part is creating the language that allows us to have these conversations in the first place.
Could not agree more with you, and we dedicate a lot of effort to actually educating a lot of creative leaders on the business side of everything they do. And I also, it's very interesting what you said about kind of ideas being the most valuable part of creativity in the future, because you're right, with industrialization, the craftsmanship kind of went away, because you could produce a lot of things by a machine, so the craftsmanship wasn't as important as the original, whether it's design or the product. And now we are moving from that, because you can create as many shapes or forms of things as you want with AIs and with just any other tools, to be honest. But the idea is something that still will differentiate something from incredible, excellent, and something that will change what we see in the world from something ordinary that already exists. Going back to your first point about how can we add something to AI rather than try to compete with it.
Yeah, look, it's also that, I guess it's the nature of the debate and conversation, because you currently, if you work in luxury, for example, the big debate about dupes. So some people have a view that dupes are essentially fakes, and therefore in the way that we previously challenged fakes and banned them, whatever. But actually, there's a growing argument to say that in themselves, dupes, which are super real copies of an original piece, whether it's virtual or actually real, have a legitimacy. So I always think you need to look at the conversation. So what are we talking about? We're saying that these dupes are less crafted, less conceived, less detailed than the original. Well, then no, they're not, because actually they are dupes. They are exact replicas in every living detail. And if I take my microscope in, I would see the number of stitching that sits in the original Prada bag and sits in the new one. So we'd have to almost reinvent our notion of what craft is in that sense. We've just finished quite a big piece on looking at luxury recrafted, where we accepted the essential principle that the dupes are not just a reality, but are equally valuable. And if you look at virtual stock exchanges, or look at real exchanges where you're selling vintage, dupes are realizing values that are greater than the original, because people are investing more, I guess, power and belief and desirability in them. So I do think we also need to change the conversation we have about craft, the conversation we have about originality, particularly in an age of, deep fakes, in an age of where it will be possible to replicate things so stunningly similar that the arguments we use to distinguish what is art or what is craft or what is original will be made completely redundant. And if we stick with those arguments, we end up becoming redundant ourselves, because is that the argument? When photography came along, did we really cling to the representation of your portraiture? Did we really say, well, painting does it better? It does it differently. And then out of that, we had cubism, and we had vorticism, and we had kind of impressionism, which was a breaking up of the real space in terms of capturing an image. So I think rather than I guess look at these things as threats, as creatives, my question is, how does it alter my positioning as a creative? How does it change my view, my intention, but also how does it improve my skill? It goes back to that CEO thing again. You really get people who cling to the old ways. It was better before, or it was better when we did this. Or we go, well, that was the past, and what sits in the past may not sometimes have answers as to what should sit in the future. The learning process is now. My argument is that you do three things. You set out on a journey. Rather than object to things, you listen to them, you absorb them, you understand the landscape. Then you ask the questions, you test it, you play with it. Meanwhile, you're absorbing that knowledge, but you're also not doing it like a sponge. You're having a certain critical, but being critical isn't the same as a refusal. And I find a lot of people refusing, generative AI, or refusing, uh, you, you know, kind of advances in science, because it threatens their position as humans. And I think, well, if we're not threatened as humans, how do we know our position? The whole point about who we are, unless there are existential threats that really challenge us to think differently. So the 19th century, that huge shift, in mechanization, the run into photography, our understanding of science, of arts, of architecture, suddenly force us to reconsider our positioning. And I think that's what's happening now, that we're having to do that. And as creatives, because think about, we'd be in our 20s, our 30s, or 40s, we have another 50 years left. And are we really going to spend 50 years complaining and whinging and objecting to, when we could be getting on and doing better and more brilliant and more progressive? What is our position in the world? I think we're now being asked by AI to take a position. And when I hear people complaining about it, I just worry. I worry that, gosh, this could be the end. It could be the sixth extinction, and we won't be around to enjoy the seven, because it'll be the robots making decisions for us.
This is brilliant what you said about having this open mind and exploring and observing what's around us, and kind of playing around with whether it's new technologies or new concepts to see where it takes us. I suppose if we take the metaphor that you used about after appearing, the photography being invented, that the new art movement appeared because, I suppose, making the most photorealistic portrait stopped being an objective because you could do it with photography. So therefore the objectives change, and people focused more on ideas or anything else that would make them different. So what would you say creatives need to focus on now, if the objective changed? What kind of skills, apart from understanding business, which I think is a very useful way to understand the world and seeing how things work, but what other skills specifically for creative people would be relevant in the future?
And look, it's skills which I think every creative has, usually without even thinking about it. If you think about curiosity, I was asking recently, we're talking about what were the two big skills future leaders should have, or creatives, or if I was teaching AI two essential skills, it would be curiosity and it would be empathy. And I think that, those two together, um, then allow you to look at what skills you need, as the landscape changes and as sectors change. And so, for example, chatting to kind of architects, the skills were pretty specific. Now I'm meeting architects who only work in the digital realm. I'm meeting architects whose job is only to work on digital twinning. So they're very specific, where their job is not to work in the real world, their job is to work in the virtual, and to understand what they call the mechanics of the virtual, so they can do their best work within the constraints of the virtual realm, where, as we know, gravity can be challenged. We can challenge how smell works. I'm looking at a digital framework which was based on synesthesia. So the architect was no longer building, in kind of bricks and mortar and steel and glass. They were building in sense and touch and taste. So the essential skills perhaps are nascent, but what I discovered when I spoke to them is curiosity. What if I could build in smell? I could create a master plan in smell and use similar constraints that I'd find in architecture, but I'm going to do it in smell. Well, that's curiosity, and it's not necessarily a taught skill as yet. Although I'm seeing architectural schools do them. I'm seeing bioinformatics labs doing it. I'm seeing Silicon Valley invest hugely in the whole issue of biohacking and longevity and transhumanism. Core to that is not going to be the scientists, it's going to be the creatives. It's going to be the biohackers, the engineers, what I'm going to call the body architects, the life architects. So there's lots of skills expanding, but unless I'm curious, I won't even know what those things are. And unless I have empathy, I won't quite know what it means to inhabit those future bodies or those future spaces, unless I understand from the inside out what these things look and feel and taste like. It sounds fantastic, but I'm already seeing so much work, because we spend a time looking at and living in the future, where already entire industries are forming that we don't even have languages to describe what those industries are, or how the job description would look to find me a bio architect who specializes only in synesthesia, designing bodies for the virtual realm.
This is fascinating what you're saying. And I love that you live in this future where there are so many things that are happening that are not happening in the day-to-day world. So I feel like you see so many interesting pockets of the futures, of different futures that might happen and might become mainstream, or might stay in this kind of very unique and niche and maybe even fruitful and successful niche, but still kind of a very separate one. It was very interesting when you said about the kind of the empathy and curiosity as the skills that designers and creatives need to develop and focus more. And I suppose it kind of follows the same narrative of hard skills are getting less and less valuable. Again, if we go back to the painting example, the ability to paint well becomes less important than ability to come up with a new style or think of something no one thought of before, and how you express yourself rather than your technique. And similar way now, I suppose your hard skills, whatever they are not as important, because you can get the tools to help you, but your imagination, your empathy, your curiosity, all these other things that we as humans have, we need to work on them. We need to emphasize them. We need to make sure we use the full power of them.
It is about training, because people, you need to be trained to be curious. Sometimes we have an innate skill, but actually a lot of the time we don't activate curiosity in a positive, or what I would call strategic way. Empathy, yes, we kind of know what it is, but if I'm sitting in a room and I'm watching, part of empathy is listening and observing. And I in a room of like 5 to 7 people, probably 1.2 of those people are actually actively listening or being actively curious. And like I said, we bring the agendas into the room with us, and our job is to deploy those agendas as quickly and speedily as we can. And how we come out of that room, we feel we've done our job when we feel that the majority of people in that room feel like we do. But that's not, that's kind of not how it should be. And I think so. These skills need to be taught better and more effectively and strategically. The other bit is just to go back to your earlier point. I think I'm not trying to downgrade, because for a moment, like I look at art, for example, you've got Venice Biennale at the moment. There's quite a lot of representational painters who are there, because representationalism has become a new ism, because we've so dismissed it and so pushed it off the kind of mainstream agenda. If you think about vinyl, there are more artists releasing on vinyl than the entire history of vinyl. You almost go, this is like mad and brilliant that a retrograde technology has made an appearance. But what is different about it is the context is different. The curiosities are different. The reasons, it's a sound quality, it's a tactility. There's a really brilliant chance to reinvent graphics, to reinvent how we record sound in the digital age. We're exploring things. It's not that I want the past cancelled and everybody to look to the future. I just think with all of these shifts, so that push to streaming, whatever, made us revisit analog, and it made us not appreciate, but reinterpret what analog means in the current environment, where it's increasingly digital, it's increasingly layered, it's increasingly, sitting in the metaverse. So I think that's what I mean about the curious bit and the empathy bit. And I think the other thing is to consider how, when you see all of these things out of those, and I'm going to call it, intersectionality in terms of cultural and intellectual and curious intersectionality, is all of these things coalescing create new sparks and new innovations and new ideas. So I just feel that we just need to reactivate how we look at the world. I think a lot of us have become tired of the world. I've got friends who go, I don't watch the news anymore, it's terrible. Well, that's the nature of news. That we need to embrace it and engage with it, and have a vitality and a point of view about, as artists and creatives, how we respond. Because that's the other bit, isn't it? It's not just that we're curious, it's not just that we are empathic. What are we now responding? How are we responding? And my other bit to that is, because I think as a business we have this constant debate, are we responding in a way that makes the world better or different or worse? Because I think if you fall to the third bit, why are you bothering? Unless your evil is your ultimate aim and goal. My view is you should only be making something different or better. And for a creative, that's a hugely challenging, because it's easy to make things cheaper, do stuff that's like fast fashion, but it's not making the world better. So how do I do that? And how do I make the world different? And they're the bits I feel that we've become a bit jaded and dismissive at a time when we need to re-engage and challenge and not let people off the hook so easily. You know, it's not. I don't think it's good not to have a point of view. When people say, I don't really think about that, like, why don't you? You know, the planet's dying. Why aren't you thinking?
You are so right about not just receiving information and being curious, but also thinking about how we respond as creatives, because creativity at the end of the day doesn't stop at the imagination point. It actually means creating something, and which could be a response, your reaction, your reflection on something, whatever that is. And actually, in our earlier questionnaire about what futures are people interested in, a lot of people asked about the human side of things, of social, about inclusivity, about mental health, what global communities, what are these futures of humans. So what do you see, how is humanity and society changing, whether it is in the way we respond to things because the world is changing, or in general, how do you feel like humanity is changing or will be changing in the future?
As I said, changing to the point that potentially those who are born now, so if you think about a child being born now, all things being equal in terms of accessibility to health, to education, to kind of what I always call intellectual and physical sustenance. So not about wealth, just about what we can do that. That child, he, she, they will live to an average about 110, maybe 120, but I'm going to put it at 110. The reason I think that's fascinating is if they last that long, it is possible that there will be a species in the world that are transhuman, that will be unrecognizable to them. They will be as different from Neanderthal and Homo sapien in the sense that we are already putting in place a huge amount of genetic, a huge amount of bio, of synthetic, of trans sciences, things that allow us to re-edit what it is to be human. That we now need to start thinking about that question straight. What is it to be human? Is it just about our physical appearance? Is it about our ability to rationalize, our ability to empathize? Is it about our ability to effectively kill other humans? Because we mustn't forget that all things being equal, we've kind of while we've improved our overall value in the planet, we've also over the past 20 years developed more effective ways to kill each other. So the kind of there's a, and if that's a definition of human, then it is possible that a generative form of intelligence may reject that on the grounds that it's damaging to the overall ambitions of the planet. And as a consequence, we may be in a position where our children, these intelligent algorithms that we've created, may decide, like a lot of children do, to rebel against the parent and to challenge the parent on the grounds that the parent is just not doing their job effectively for the future of the planet. Because there is a whole current debate, which I think a lot of people watching will be aware of, about how we measure out, intergenerational justice and intergenerational thinking. So a decision we make now, as we've discovered with slavery, as we discovered with in the 19th century, our treatment of how women, gay, etc., we now go back and judge those moments. As a consequence, looking forward, we will understand that decisions we make now, as innocent as they seem, will be judged in the same way. So a part of our job is to make decisions now and have conversations that will allow our future ancestors not to look back at us and go, wow, how awful they were. Weren't they the most terrible people ever? Because it could be that those future ancestors may not be human in the way we recognize the human species. We have to have more engaged, pointed, challenging conversations as creatives, because in some ways we are closer to creating what this thing will look like. We're designing the housing for the robotic systems. We're looking at the future of driverless cars. We're looking at planes that no longer need pilots and no longer need engines in the way we understand them. And if that's the case, we have to think about the other things these things will be doing. Because remember, they're going to be connected to the internet. Everything is going to be a single sentient system, and you're contributing to this. So what's your better bit? The point I was saying earlier, what's your different bit? Because if you get those two things right, the chances are we could be around in our current form like vinyl, we could be given a second chance and a second life because people go, oh, they weren't too bad. But I think at the moment, if machine technology, which it will do over the next 3 to 5 years, passes the Turing test, which is certainly about to happen, we will be left in a pretty embarrassing position. It's like your child catching you on the toilet seat when you just think you're going in to have a quick break. Oh my God, that's not a cool way to be. So I just feel that we need to up the ante, get more involved, and as creatives, we really can't afford to allow other people to make those decisions. We have to be involved in the decision-making process.
This is a very empowering way to think about it, that first of all, that we can make a difference, and the difference starts now, and we will be, and our ancestors will be looking back at this time and at the decisions that we made. And it's not just about whether one company made billion revenue or not. It's just more fundamental life, human decisions that we all as a society are making right now, how we think, the conversations we have or don't have. And it's fascinating to think that, 100, 200,000 years in the future, those decisions will be judged. It's quite interesting that you mentioned that concept. We're actually hosting soon a gala at Futureland Academy that has the theme of future heritage. And essentially we think about what is the heritage that we want to leave in the future, and again, how does that connect, or also how do we reflect on the heritage that we had in a kind of perspective of the future. So I love thinking about this connection between the past and the future, and what can we leave behind us as a better place.
I guess it is that, it's the heritage versus legacy. One is where, people say we can't change the past. We can change the past. While we can't alter the material aspects or residue it has left with us, we can shine a light on what I call the corners of a room that were invisible when we first visited that part of the past. And as we're discovering, the past wasn't white, and it wasn't privileged, and it wasn't male. It had this whole plethora of things that were just left untouched because it wasn't convenient. And as always, when, the victors write the history of whatever the past, they are the ones that come out as the winners. So I think we can revisit heritage and relook at it and redefine it and discover more about ourselves. And I mean ourselves in the collective global sense. And then we have to think about legacy, because a heritage doesn't define legacy. It may have some contribution to make to it, but in itself, and this is what I always think when people say, oh, we've always done it this way, and this is how our culture is, and tradition is a great thing. Tradition has never been a great thing. Tradition has done more damage. It has killed more people. It has slowed down progress. Tradition, well, women were second-class citizens. Well, let's just leave it with tradition. Tradition, gay people should be put into prison or have their hands chopped off or whatever. Well, let's leave it with tradition. We don't believe that. So we also need to confront the whole process about people who say that we should change things only incrementally. Well, it suits them, but it doesn't suit the rest of the world. So what is our heritage and what is our legacy destination? And that's the bit I think about the future that we talk about. We've got to plan what legacy we would like to leave behind. So the CEO, she will go, okay, we've got a heritage business here. I work with a lot of CEOs that talk about their heritage. And I go, what's your legacy? When you leave this job or when you leave this planet, what have you left behind that you will be proud of and you will feel that you've made a contribution to the net improvement of our overall lifestyle? And my argument probably for the majority of CEOs is fuck all. They leave very little. They leave a lot of trouble and they dodge what I call the 5-year gap. So the reason I'm also keen on heritage and legacy is all of your shares, all of your bonuses, all of your long-term investment should be tied into legacy. And you get it after 10 years or whatever number of years, but it should come with what I call a responsibility clause. Because if we don't, we are not holding people responsible to the future. And in the way that we're now holding people up for issues of slavery rightly, we also need to hold people to the future. If we want to live on this planet, I want to know that your decision will benefit me as well as benefit you and your shareholders and your stakeholders. So I just feel that to me is design, and that is creativity, because we're having to look at things around and design forward as well as visit back.
And I could not agree more with your thought that, first of all, the companies and the leaders should be thinking about what they're doing for the future, and also for now, for the planet, beyond the financial balance and beyond the product that might be even very good. But again, in the broader context of the world, what are we doing with our products and services to cultures, to societies, to the environments, how we are affecting them right now and how they will be affected in the future. So what can we do about this? Because there is also a kind of a pessimistic narrative that, look, it's capitalism. No matter how much goods you want in the world, the financial benefits of the C-level team will always win. So you can do it through regulations and governments, and there's kind of one way. Is there a more creative way to approach this good incentives for the leadership teams?
I think, look, it's always a difficult balance, because if you talk about growth versus degrowth, you're already positioning yourself politically. So, if I talk about growth, I'm automatically on the right. If I talk about degrowth, I'm automatically on the left. And I think actually increasingly, as I look at it, and we do a lot of work where, in fact, we just did a big generations report. So if I'm 20, 30, 40, I don't have such a binary view about what constitutes growth as being right wing and degrowth as left wing. My question is, how are we defining growth? So I think that's one thing, because productivity and growth are not the same thing. We can uncouple them. And growth for what? Is it growth for prosperity, or is it growth for uplifting the mean level of poverty? In which case, that's surely a more powerful growth. And it doesn't follow that if I improve the wealth at the top of the pyramid, that it trickles down to the bottom. In fact, all research shows that the opposite happens. If you have the wealth at the top, it stays at the top. Doesn't come down unless there's a trade-off. So one, I think we're beginning to revisit and redefine how we measure, because I think it is about, I hate that term, but I understand why people use it, how we measure value and values. And I think now we need to define what it is that we are looking at in country. We've already looked at happiness index. We've looked at kind of GDP is potentially not a great way to kind of measure true progress. But I think we need to look at holistically how we feel we need to move forward. So, for example, there is I guess it is the Future Ancestors movement, which is about and they do it in places like Japan, for example, where members of a village or a community will come together to represent the future ancestors of the village. And they say, okay, we're going to make a decision now, but let us see how that will affect people 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. And I think what I am keen to advocate, and certainly from my work in foresight, is long-termism. Growth is always about short-term, because it requires you to increase productivity, to increase product, to increase output. And as you know, and as people are seeing, the more we do that, the more potentially will damage the planet. So we're measuring the wrong things, because if I'm measuring more stuff, the inevitability of more stuff is more damage, more pollution, more bad health, etc. On the other hand, if I'm measuring progress and I'm defining progress as uplift of poverty, equity, improvement of health, well-being, one of the key things that we talk about now, that requires a different set of activations on behalf of my government and a different set of active behavior. And, brands are interesting, because who would have thought a brand would make money from wellness? We used to make money from making people fat and making them buy more and consume more. And now there's a whole push towards less and defined and clarity and spirituality. We're still making money from it, but I would put a bet on somebody meditating is not going to consume as much junk as somebody who's been out forced to go shopping, because the shopping is going to make them happy. And these debates are happening. It's not me ranting and raving in a box in London. It is a fact that I know people are having these conversations globally, and it's not culturally specific. That's what I like about it. If I look at across the planet, everybody is talking about well-being and mental health. Everybody is asking the questions about, growth, to what consequence. Everybody is looking at how we define a sense of personal, and somebody used this term. I actually do a podcast on it later in the year on enoughness. So where's the point of equilibrium that we are not measuring our ability to outflank other people by how much we have versus how little they have, which is how we've tended to do it. And interestingly, I work with a lot of wealth, people in the kind of wealth space, and there is a huge movement to cap the limits of people's wealth, and I'm in favor of it because if billionaires own as much as they do, and they own the GDP of how many countries, how many planets, is there not a requirement for people to have their wealth capped, because their wealth is made at huge consequence to the rest of the planet? And if that was the case in a city or a country where one person had so much power thought they were beginning to use it in a particularly damaging way, then we would challenge it. So increasingly, we are seeing governments take on a view that wealth in itself is not an indicator that this person is necessarily going to do good for the planet. And if anything, when I scratch the wealth, I find certain things beneath that are unpalatable and unforgivable. Why shouldn't I punish them? I don't want to sound like I'm being miserable about people making money, but I do think unbridled wealth is as damaging as poverty. It is as damaging as war, because war we can see pretty much as like what's happening in Gaza. We see these things firsthand, but with unbridled wealth, we don't see it because it can be kept in the shadows until it's too late for us to challenge it. And that's Silicon Valley's story. It's been the history of wealth generation that at all points, when we get to that level of wealth, we have to introduce ways to curb it for the greater good, because it doesn't trickle down. In fact, it does a lot of damage in the process of building up.
This is fascinating what you're saying, because as you said, the question is in the measurement, and question is what we measure is what we value. I think within the businesses, we know that mantra, because essentially what you keep track of, whether it's your metrics, whether it's your traffic, your finance, that means your team will prioritize it. On a global scale, it seems the same. If we are talking about GDP of the country, therefore every country will try to increase their GDP. And if that's the only known measurement of a success of a country, then of course every country will try to do that. I wonder if this is a cultural shift. I'm very happy to hear that these conversations are happening. I think that gives me so much optimism that, again, it's not just all of us in this conversation just hope for the better future. There are conversations already happening, but I wonder how much of it is a cultural shift, because it does trickle down. If we talk about money, again, capitalism, fun, if we measure countries by GDP, we measure people by the wealth that they made, and we measure companies by their turnover. We measure everything through money. How can we change it on such a societal level that seems like currently is literally across everything that we do?
There are a couple of indicators of, I think, subtle change. I won't say cataclysmic change, because I think these things can take time. But if I looked at 10 years ago, if I was having conversations about collectivist thinking and conversations about the notion of collaboration, what I'm going to call crowdsourced creativity, they were kind of not marginal conversation, but people would just go, oh, yeah, right. We're now, again, I see huge movements of collectivist thinking, which is about, it's like partly like looking at DAO systems where people are developing ways of contributing and ways of offering their knowledge, their insight, their skills, but not necessarily expecting tacit payment or explicit payment rather in return. So we're beginning to see this sort of, and I don't seem like it's some sort of communist utopia set in San Francisco. It's not. It's sort of a bigger movement collectively where people recognize that state institutions and corporations and kind of more institutional brands are not in themselves going to save the planet. So we have to become more proactive and we have to become more involved. So on one level, if I look at across the West, there's a good decline in interest in politics, but there's an increase in interest in community. There is both a good and a bad thing there, because community, as we've seen, can take on very nationalistic viewpoints, or they can take on fairly, measured, let's kind of get together and sort this out. And I think the pluses of social media, as opposed to the negatives, which everybody knows about, is that it has allowed us to form unlikely and loose bonds to tackle specific things and then to disband that group at the end of it. But what I mean by that is, if you think about COVID, looking at how quickly we accelerated knowledge and thinking to come up with a vaccine. You're seeing the same principles being applied by academics to, well, imagine we saw poverty as a pandemic. It would change our thinking as to how we tackle it, because now it will involve us coming up with using science, technology, innovation, different kind of social structures. And I think what we're beginning to see is a collectivist sensibility come through that shifts hierarchies and changes that debate between left or right, kind of positive and negative. And I think that's a good change. And I see that particularly, we do a lot of work, for example, in master planning. It was called master planning, which, you go, what an objectionable term. So one of those great terms, as you use it, you think, what a stupid term. It's like, it really brings up all the worst case of imposed, hierarchical systems and orders and plans versus how cities or places or things have developed over time. They've been slightly chaotic, slightly collectively done, cheek by jowl, serendipitous. So all of those things that were seem alien to the thinking in the process are now becoming part of how we develop a system, like decentralization, federation, allowing people to make decisions in a more collective, collaborative way. That's the positive. The negative is where those things can be taken into dark places. We see what's happening in America. We're probably, in some ways, I have a lot of friends who work in different countries, in different states and different organizations. And they say there's a real sense that civil war is possible. I come from a country like Ireland where civil war wasn't just possible, it happened. You would argue twice. In the 70s and 80s, there was a civil war going on. So it's not impossible. But we do need to accept that there are better ways to manage, and it may not always be the hierarchical way. But if it is a different way, what does that look like? What does collectivism in the 21st century, in politics, in developing, cities, in our creative work? Because I often see when designers, particularly, when you talk to them about collectivist thinking and collectivist design, some are really happy because it's a shared experience and conversation. It's a kind of coercive process. A lot of people are not, because they fear it will take away the value of the signature or the value of their handwriting. And I know a lot of architects who, when I mention the notion of, why not have the building done by 6 people instead of 1? They have a panic attack. This notion that you'd have to negotiate and sit down and discuss a building that potentially might suit other people rather than your ego is quite shocking to a lot of people. So I kind of feel we're at a point where these things are being socialized and are out there ready, and how much are we involved in that, and how much are we kind of taking the lead or taking the listen to get on with the conversation.
I feel like you just went into such an interesting area that about socialism and about collectivism and collaboration. I feel like that's definitely something that I feel is potential opportunity for the future. So we'll definitely continue conversation about that. And actually, Martin, you said something interesting about the architecture, and the example that immediately came to my mind, that Barbican, one of my favorite places in London, has been built by 3 architects. And the reason why it's so eclectic and so multi dimensional from the culture perspective, from the architecture perspective. Potentially, I don't know, but it seemed like it because there was this collaboration rather than ego-driven scenario. And as far as I remember the story, they all entered the competition for the building together and decided whoever wins, all three of them will
They
work on
work
the
together.
building.
I think they're good examples because you know increasingly as you're working with planners, they recognize the value of diverse thinking both in the superstructure, like the hardware and the software. And that, it's not new because we've always had that happening in cities at a very basic, what I would call a feral level. Our medieval cities grew up in those ways, and then occasionally something got burnt down or there was a fire, and then we kind of came back and rebuilt. And as long as you had all of that thinking, and I always think cities I visit where I feel most intrigued by the city has been a product of multiple iterations, huge social diversity, massive influx of, kind of immigrants. I come from Ireland to live in England, so I see England differently. I look at London and I go, it's a great city because of its diversity, because of those challenges that sit within a city. New York, similar thing, Paris, Sao Paulo. You see and you feel that energy. And I do think that to embrace that and get it right. I did a really interesting podcast with, I think it's Christian Bausch, who teaches business entrepreneurship, but he does it through serendipity. He said you have more to learn through accidental encounters and how they brush up on you and the business opportunity that offers you than if you have a planned strategic approach to how you're going to make whatever. And I think what he was thinking about is how the accidental nature of things encourages creativity, sparks innovation, and drives opportunity. So it's sort of one that's like a domino effect on the other. And I think the somebody asked a question. I was looking in the chat about the future of diversity. At the moment, the debates that we have about diversity, about inclusion, about equity, intersectionality, they are all under threat. And I'm happy for that because as soon as things are under threat, we understand why they are needed more than ever. Because otherwise, it's just a word. We talk about a word, and intersectionality is such a powerful word. It's still, I don't think, understood in the way it should be understood. It's what I call entanglement. If I look at the principles in forecasting, traditional forecasts are quite linear. Then there's a it's a bit like a weave. There's 3 or 4 overlaps, but actually, reality is entanglement. So many things bang into each other and cross each other that affect us in different ways that it's almost impossible to imagine. And yet, here we are in the 21st century, a product of intersectionality, and we still need to understand what that truly means. So I think the future, if we get it right, and this is what I mean about planning those futures, it is exactly what we should be looking to. When I look at plans now and I look at propositions and I hear conversations, I'm thinking, how do people, in the way we're now defining people, figure in that? It's kind of that's the question as designers, creatives, architects, environmental planners. We need to think about people first. I don't think we do. We think about the plan first, and then how we shoehorn people into that plan, rather than think about the people first. What were they like? Oh God, they want this, this, and this. Well, we don't give it to them. That's the problem. We do these terrible, what do you call, where you go out and you ask people what they think, and then you ignore them. I mean, that's yes, that was called planning sessions. Yes.
This is so interesting about what you say about the multi. Did you say multi?
Multidisciplinary, yeah, multidisciplinarian, yeah.
I feel like I have real hope for this to happen on a more broader scale, because what you said about the CEOs under 35 or young businesses and startups, when I look at the companies that are started by younger people in their 20s, they are much more diverse in terms of the talent, in terms of the
Yeah,
skills, in terms of the types of people, as well as each individual. As you know, currently no one wants to have one career. People, or not one, many people don't want one career. Many people want to have this 3 days doing this, one day doing this, 1 hour doing this throughout their life, and kind of exploring and changing their paths from one thing to another, which is beautiful because that creates this multidisciplinarity kind of in your own self, as well as you assemble the team of people who come from all these different walks of lives and experiences. It creates this wonderful environment where something completely different can spark, and the intersection of whether it's science and creativity and design and who knows what else in this mix can create something new. So definitely optimistic about this.
I think it's part of the beauty. So you have, I think you have general knowledge, generalist knowledge, and specific. We have from the 19th century, and I always see, you know, in kind of, you look at Western culture, we hived off specialisms because it suited how we were teaching science, you know, it suited how we were teaching art, how we were teaching kind of built environment skills. And I think now we're understanding that actually we need to collapse them back together. You know, unless we're trying to understand what these things ultimately mean, we'll need to pull them together, which was a sort of you know, if you think about the 18th century, if you think about the Enlightenment, you had somebody like Newton, who was an alchemist and an astronomer, and there was no dispute that he couldn't shift from one to the other. You know, we understood that these things slightly, and I think about now in CERN, you know, where they put quantum physicists and poets together. And of course you would, because how do you describe something as magnificent as a Higgs boson particle when it's impossible to identify? Well, actually, a poet could do this brilliantly. In the scene in Contact, I think it's Jodie Foster in Contact, where she's trying to understand what she's looking at as a scientist and an astronomer and an astrophysicist. And she says they should have sent a poet because essentially they're doing the same job. They're describing the indescribable. And I think we're now bringing those two things together, not two, but, you know, we're connecting the head back with the emotions and going, why did we ever divide them? You know, the future surely will only be solved in this way, that we're pulling all of these things back together. And hence, I think there's a massive cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary thinking. When you look at even publishing world, you see a number of books coming out that are just about multiplicity, not about specialism, because we understand that we need to have a more rounded, complex, nuanced view about the universe if we really to kind of stay in it over the next 500,000 years or whatever.
You just gave me so many thoughts and ideas, and I feel like I'll probably have to dive into all of them for the next few hours, including like the link between science and art, and how currently we just talked about chief design officer and how important for creatives to be at a C-level. And that made me think, when will chief science officer become a same kind of level of importance, considering that scientists, and I know lots of brilliant scientists who face exactly the same challenges as creatives of not understanding the business side, not being able to communicate their ideas and the wonderful things that they're doing. As you said, the poets can describe potentially better. So maybe there's some sort of emerging science and design together at some sort of leadership level.
Education, you're seeing those coming together of you know, STEM or STEAM, you know, where we're putting the A back in, the arts back into it, not because people feel that art was, I mean, look, it was, the A's, the architecture, the arts, you know, they were marginalized, but actually, as we begin to engage better with our understanding of quantum and our understanding of particle physics and dark matter, and all of those areas that always seem a bit mysterious, we understand that they sit truly closer to art and conceptual thinking than they do to traditional mathematics. If anything, what we're discovering is what used to be two parallel tunnels actually are leading us into the same system of thought. And if you look at the latest literature on kind of dark matter, antimatter, white holes instead of black holes, suddenly the language I'm reading in those books is closer to prose poetry. It's closer to how an artist has to, in their head, conceptualize something that's unimaginable and then capture it in some form of art. And I would imagine that a quantum physicist would have more in common with a poet or an artist than they would have with a traditional CEO or whatever. And that's why I think the future of how we define business in that thinking is up for grab. Science is now becoming part of the arts because I just realized science has made things so malleable, synthetic science, biotech, biohacking, data infographics. So it's just suddenly I'm going, wow, this is like a fantastic world we're about to step into, but we have to prepare a new language for it. Otherwise, we will be like Jodie Foster on that scene in Contact, where she just can't describe what it is she's looking at.
Oh, you're giving me so much excitement about science that I feel like that potentially something that I personally want to explore more of and dive deeper in. But let's take few questions from our lovely audience. Aspara is asking if you've noticed any weak signals for wild cards, any upcoming radical events on your radar at the moment.
I think not so much a radical event, but I think it's where we'll have a coalescing of three things, because I think we've separated. We have AI, quantum has sort of appeared there, and I'm not sure people, have really thought about how powerful the quantum concept, not the computer, but the concept will be. And then I look at the metaverse. So I'm going to bang those three together. And I think, oh my gosh, look at what's happening. If I suddenly put these things together, that's a wild card beyond our imagination, because the extrapolative power of quantum harnessed to the undoubted thinking abilities of AI mixed into a metaverse where I can sit inside an idea as opposed to watch the idea is an incredible, fantastic, bizarre, unprecedented concept. So again, it's a bit like if I could step into your dream, you would think, well, that's kind of amazing. Sometimes we don't want to do that. But if I look at the technology, the firepower, the iterative power of quantum and the metaverse and AI, it would be possible for me to dream and to have that dream replicated inside a metaverse, and for you to step in via your porthole and live in my same dream. And the computing power of the AI and and what I'm seeing now in rendering speed will allow us to build essentially a living, live digital twin that you and I could inhabit at the same time. So in some ways, the red pill and the blue pill are kind of redundant. They are metaphors now that we no longer need to see it as a metaphor. It's becoming a reality. And I think that sense of, as I said, in 1880, I was watching horses going around the street. And in 1905, we've had the general theory of relativity, and we have cubism, and we have atonal music. Something happened at that moment that changed the world. And I think we're about to go through that now. And I just fear that we're expecting anomalies to come through that will shock us. But all of these things, as I said, in 1880, were sitting there. They were just sitting on the sidelines. They weren't wild cards. They were just adjacent technologies that weren't being harnessed in the way that by 1910 they were being harnessed. And by 1918, they were used to devastating effect. And I think that's the bit we could potentially, you were seeing now. So I'm fascinated to see how we will deal with it. And do we have I guess the emotional capability as well as the intellectual capacity to understand how these things will work?
Wow, my imagination is exploding now, thinking about all futures that we might live in, and it is very inspiring, and I do look forward to seeing more in the world of metaverse and how we will connect as humans. There is a related question to that, about how do we need to see any shifts in education. So first of all, to talk about what we discussed before, to harness empathy and balance of emotions, but also the technological growth, and will AI and its growth with humanoids, robots, and avatars create more dissonance for the young?
Again, I guess it's how you're looking at the challenge. And, if we see that AI or related technologies will force us to think again what it means to be in the way that social media. So, for example, it's interesting that social media was all about connection. It kind of was meant to be bringing us together, allowing us channels to communicate. Where official channels presented a very linear view of the world. Suddenly now we have this kind of overlapping ecosystem that allows us to have a much more nuanced view of the world. It has done the opposite. Not my thinking, because I kind of feel I'm not so believing that social media just turned us into a world of self-serving narcissists who will only speak to people who look like us and think like us and behave like us. It's certainly one route that we have taken, but it's also now started reminding. So if I talk to and we do a lot of research in different age groups and cohorts. So 16, 18, 18, 23, while one group are talking about anxiety and social media, the other group, the younger group, are talking about the benefit of re-engagement again, of live interaction, spending time with the friends. Oh my God, that's weird. Spent so much time online that now we're seeking out human companionship and company. And I think what we also need to understand is, in itself, technology is neither good or bad. People will have different views about it, but it's how we interact with it that becomes a defining moment. And one generation interacted with social media, it was just communication. Like our grandparents used Facebook to keep up to date with their grandchildren. Conspiracy theories use it to keep up to date with the latest quote-on kind of whatever notion. So I go, it's how we relate to it. So are we teaching people? This is to go back to education, in the way that I would teach people how to do a dove joint in carpentry, teaching people how to proactively or measurably engage with social media. I'm not. So why am I surprised? You wouldn't give a child a knife unsupervised and let them run about waving it. You would explain to them, adults, and I include myself in this, sometimes we need to look at what is it we understand about connection? What is it we understand about serendipity, reciprocity? Because these are all the things that matter in a social network situation. If I troll somebody, it's not just unpleasant, but it's hugely destabilizing for my personal sense of what being human is about, which is having a responsibility to others as well as a responsibility to myself. So I think we need to go back to educating people about consequence, responsibility, and use, because sometimes while we think we should, send a note, we go, actually, it's just inappropriate. And I just feel that a lot of those people who are feeling anxious with social media are also coming around to think about, well, how do we deal with it? We're not going to shut the thing down. So what's the rules of engagement? What's the rules of as something said, equitable companionship? One of the people I interviewed there, she said, if we think about equitable companionship, what does it mean? How does it feel to be nice, to be kind? What would we expect in those moments? And how do we replicate that when we're doing the things we do? Because we've forgotten about those dynamics. And I think that's the bit that happily, when I chat to different age groups, they're beginning to ask the same question, about the responsibility versus the access and opportunity. I can access these things and have the opportunity to do so, but what are my responsibilities? And that's how you get new communities forming and new, I guess, ethics and new senses of how we would like the world to be. So I kind of feel that the other term that we're forever encountering is the notion of woke. This terrible phrase. I go, well, first of all, what are people asking you to do except to behave in a mannerly fashion towards them? And if that's what woke is, to use that terrible kind of the way people put it in inverted commas, what is wrong with people asking you to be respectful? What is wrong with asking you to not call them by the wrong pronoun? If I said, I want you to call me Martin, I'm not going to call you Jack. Why would you do that? And yet this is how, so I said a lot of the time we also need to look at context and to look at how a different generation may have a different view about manners and a different view about respect. Why is that terrible? These are, I think, the bad things happening, but the good things are that we're now asking how we can change this positively, rather than, I think what's happening, we're bringing in legislation to change what? How do you legislate against social media. It's pretty impossible. And my suspicion is, I know somebody's talking about Luddites not being anti-tech. Well, they are. I mean, if you look at the definition of Luddite, it's somebody who felt technology was displacing them. And my question is, but displacing you to do what? So at the moment, rather than trying to silence people on social media, we should be asking ourselves, how do you make these environments and systems more equitable to other people, rather than trying to make them more unfriendly or close down those people who've got a different opinion, you know?
It's very interesting what you were saying about overall, again, social media and technology and how we interact with it. And again, going back to education and the skills that we'll need for the future, it does feel like if we don't need as many hard skills that we need to learn throughout school, and our productivity or our output will depend on our imagination, which means on our mental health and our way to see the world. Therefore, we should be able to learn all these things. How do we interact with people? What does it mean to be a human? How do we interact with technologies? And again, how does it affect us? So it only makes sense that this will be the key skills that we need to learn at school if we want to be those imaginative people who won't be replaced by AIs or anything else. So it makes sense.
It's it's a difficult balance, but I always think, but there's that traditional fear that if I give in. So I've heard this as a gay person growing up, we can have a certain amount of rights, but gay people can't have children. It was always granted with a bracket. You can do this, but not that. And I always think it sits with the essential fear that if I gain something, you lose something. So if women gain equality, men lose out. This is the thinking. And I think what a lot of old nonsense. If both of us are equal, we can only gain more from that sense of equality or equitability. I think we're doing the same thing at the moment with science and progress. We're trying to limit it because if it goes this way, it'll go too far, or we will lose out, or whatever, whatever. My question is, surely we should be looking at it and saying, what do we want it to do, and how best can we achieve that? So AI, the debate currently is about this fear that somehow if we let it do what it does, it will marginalize us as people. That's kind of what I hear when I hear a lot of thinking. And I say, okay, so what is it we should be doing? If we fear it's like nuclear energy, that it can be used for good or bad, how have we looked at nuclear energy? We've contained it. So we have fairly strict regulatory laws that sit around nuclear energy in terms of both as an energy and as a weapon. And I go, do you think AI sits in the same thing? And if it does, then we should be looking at containment, not control. And if we have that debate, it's a pretty nuanced debate to have, but we're not having it. So first of all, let's define what AI is. Then let's look at what potentially it's asking us about being human, because my suspicion is it's going to take jobs we hate, and it's going to do a lot of the thinking that we hate doing anyway, and it's going to kind of annoy us a bit. Well, do I care? I don't. I more care that we are sleepwalking into a moment where we shut down the technology, that if you have friends with cancer and you have got people with pretty, what would have been not life-threatening, killing diseases, AI is doing more in the short space of time it has been around to identify root causes and help us bring about positive change than hundreds of thousands of people who've been beavering away at these things for years. So am I willing to shut down that technology because I think, you know, I'm going to wake up in the morning, I'll have to argue with an AI. You know, there are worse things in life.
I feel like this conversation is just the beginning, and definitely we will see more of ways developing. But I agree that we need to think about how we live in the world where this is a reality. We are unfortunately running out of time, even though I feel like we do need few more hours to talk about everything with you, Martin. Seriously, everyone has been enjoying this conversation so much that we might need a follow-up from there. But I would love to finish with one last question that we ask everyone who comes to our show, which is a bit more philosophical. If you could change one thing in the world, what would it be?
I always think, if I could, life expectancy. People always think about people and their own longevity. I would do it for dogs. I always think the companions we have, because our company is called the Future Laboratory. Actually, it was called after my first Labrador, the Future Lab. And you realize his lifespan is only ever between 10 and 14 years. And I think it's just not enough. it's not enough to be surrounded by the things you love and care about. So what I would do is I would change the genetic coding of dogs so that they could live as long as their human companions.
Oh my God. Okay, this answer wins the prize. Thank you
Yes,
so
and
much.
thank you for
This
asking
is the
me.
warmest. And Martin, thank you for sharing so many different insights with us today. I feel like my mind went into so many different ways that I definitely am living with so much inspiration and food for thought and things that I want to explore. So my day and my life definitely became richer from this conversation. So thank you for sharing this with all of us.
Thank you for asking me, and my apologies. I always jump about, but I always think there are tentative connections because you know it's lots of ideas. But I just think with the future, it is about a lot, and then you corral it down to a moment when you're asked to think about, you know, what this thing looked like. And the more you know, I think potentially, the more you can include everybody in that kind of future scenario or futures scenarios, as we were saying earlier. So thank you again for asking me, and I would happily come back and do round two.
We definitely need it. And thanks again, Martin. And please, everyone, follow Future Laboratory on social media. They have incredible blog and where they write about lots of future insights. And they also have their own podcast where Martin talks to fascinating people. So please do follow them everywhere. And thanks, everyone, for joining us, for asking great questions. And until next time, bye.
Indeed. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.